Rising rhetoric over the Indus River is revealing a much deeper, complex geopolitical narrative war, and it's one that really needs to be countered not with military threats, but with smart, strategic infrastructure and international investment. Welcome to Zenith Global News.
All right, let's jump right in. In tonight's Explainer, we're giving you a high-level diplomatic briefing on the resource and geopolitical dynamics unfolding in South Asia. We'll quickly move through the rising bilateral tensions, the historic Indus Water Treaty, the modern narrative war, water as a strict national necessity, the geopolitics of global investment, and finally, strategic water infrastructure. Starting off with Section 1, Rising Bilateral Geopolitical Tensions, the immediate flashpoint. We're currently watching a really complex situation where harsh environmental realities are slamming right into entrenched geopolitical strategies. To get a sense of how serious this flashpoint is, just look at the recent rhetoric. Pakistan's Defense Minister Khwaja Asif recently stated, if Pakistan feels its water security is threatened, it could wage war against India. Now, that is some incredibly significant geopolitical posturing. And honestly, it's not just talk. This kind of statement has been accompanied by reports of Pakistan actually deploying anti-drone units right along the border. They're signaling a very tangible, on-the-ground military readiness that is directly linked to resource anxiety. So the crucial thing to understand here is the massive divergence in the national stances. On one side, you have pure hyperbole in the media, on both sides of the border actually, fueling this narrative of deliberate resource deprivation, claims that the water has just been completely cut off. But on the other side, the factual reality on the ground stems from India's suspension of the Mutual Information Sharing Commission. And just for context, this suspension followed the Pahalgam terror attack and India's subsequent response, which was known as Operation Sindoor. So the disruption we're seeing, it isn't some physical blockade of a massive river. It's actually a complete breakdown in bilateral diplomatic communication. Moving on to Section 2, the Indus Water Treaty, the historical framework. To really decode the rhetoric flying around today, we absolutely have to look at the foundational agreement that's governed this water system for over 60 years. The evolution of this bilateral water diplomacy is actually quite fascinating. After a brief standstill agreement back in 1947, we saw almost a full decade of intense, high-stakes negotiations from 1951 to 1960. Ultimately, the 1960 treaty was successfully brokered with the World Bank stepping in to mediate. For decades, it stood as this incredibly resilient framework, weathering multiple actual conflicts. But today, today we find ourselves at a totally unique juncture with this unprecedented suspension of the Information Sharing Commission. To grasp the actual mechanics of the treaty, we have to zoom in on the rivers themselves. The Indus water system is made up of 6 main rivers. The treaty laid out a very clear factual division. The eastern rivers, so that's the Ravi, the Beas, and the Sutlej, were explicitly allocated to India. Meanwhile, the western rivers, the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, were allocated to Pakistan. Now, check out the overarching mathematical split this division created. The historic treaty established an 80% water allocation to Pakistan, leaving a 20% allocation to India. This heavily weighted split, it really just acknowledges the stark geographic realities of the region. These are massive, glacier-fed rivers originating up in the Himalayas and flowing naturally downward right through Pakistan toward the Arabian Sea. It was a purely practical division based entirely on natural flow and, frankly, the infrastructural capabilities they had back in 1960. Which brings us to Section 3, Decoding the Narrative War, Damming the Rhetoric. Beyond the dry ink of those historical treaties, there is a highly modernized narrative war being waged right now over exactly how India is legally using its 20% quota today. A massive piece of this puzzle is what's called run-of-the-river hydroelectricity. Basically, this means generating power from the natural downward flow of a river without significantly disrupting or permanently storing the overall water volume. So, India has been busy building these specific types of dams high up in the altitudes of Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh. And the thing is, these projects fit strictly within the treaty's parameters. Why? Because they simply use the kinetic energy of the water flowing by to generate power, without permanently halting the water that is destined for Pakistan. However, if we look downstream, the reality on the ground is currently incredibly severe. We have to acknowledge the acute agricultural crisis unfolding in Pakistan right now. We are seeing staggering reported drops in their absolutely vital canal systems. We're talking an 82% drop in the Dadu Canal, 64% in the Northwest Canal, and 38% in the Rice Canal. These aren't just numbers. These are critical life arteries for a nation where a full third of the population is being actively, severely affected by this water shortage.
Now, the popular narrative in Pakistan suggests this drop is entirely the result of some deliberate Indian blockade. But the structural, engineering reality is actually quite different. India simply does not possess the physical infrastructure, the massive impossible barricades it would take, to completely stop the mighty Indus River system from flowing downhill. It just doesn't work that way. What India has actually done, amidst the suspension of mutual communication, is strategically adjust the timing of its allowed water usage. India is simply prioritizing its perfectly legitimate 20% quota to meet its own peak summer domestic and agricultural demands, rather than releasing that water early like they used to do under previous informal mutual agreements.
This leads into Section 4, Water as a National Necessity, the Resource Reality. We really need to shift our focus away from this idea of the geopolitical weaponization of water and look squarely at the undeniable realities of environmental constraints. And this leads us to the absolute core question of this entire explainer. Is this the weaponization of water, or is it simply a climate necessity? By posing this question, we completely reframe a dispute. What might look like a punitive military or diplomatic measure from the outside looking in is, in stark reality, a desperate domestic resource prioritization driven by sheer absolute necessity.
The real root of this crisis lies in environmental constraints. Think about it. We are dealing with the super El Niño effect heavily disrupting monsoon patterns. We're seeing shrinking Himalayan glaciers, which simply means less snowmelt feeding these rivers in the first place. Add to this surging population growth and wildly escalating agricultural demands in both nations. Both India and Pakistan are staring down the barrel of critical climate-induced water shortages. The pie isn't being stolen, the pie is simply shrinking for everyone.
Which brings us to Section 5, the geopolitics of international investment, the strategic countermeasure. In modern diplomacy, especially when we're talking about vital life-or-death resources, economic interdependence is a far more effective shield than any military posturing could ever be. As a strategic countermeasure to regional instability, nations absolutely must leverage global economics. Step 1 involves securing substantial foreign direct investments from the Gulf and the Global South. We're talking nations like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, and Indonesia. Step 2, tie that foreign capital directly into domestic infrastructure projects. And step 3 is the big geopolitical payoff, deterring conflict through shared economic interests. Think about it. If global stakeholders have billions of dollars tied up in a nation's infrastructure, they suddenly have a massive vested interest in ensuring regional stability and preventing conflict. It's essentially a diplomatic firewall built entirely on capital.
Finally, Section 6, Strategic Water Infrastructure, Building the Future. Securing a nation's water future requires treating hydro infrastructure with the exact same urgency and, frankly, the exact same budget as building national defense systems. A truly robust policy action plan requires some very proactive maneuvers. First, nations have got to accelerate the construction of their domestic hydro projects to maximize their legitimate legal water usage capabilities. Second, they absolutely must prepare meticulous legal dossiers, backed by hard climate data and population metrics, ready for international courts like The Hague. Third, it's absolutely vital to preemptively brief allies in the US and Europe. You have to win the narrative war before a crisis fully erupts. And crucially, from a purely diplomatic standpoint, states must work overtime to keep issues of terrorism and water disputes in completely separate diplomatic silos. That is how you maintain the moral high ground.
So I'll leave you with this final critical thought. Will proactive diplomacy and strategic infrastructure investment actually outpace this geopolitical rhetoric before it escalates into real, kinetic conflict? Right now, it's a tight race between building dams of concrete and building dams of diplomatic narrative. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Stay informed, stay aware, stay ahead, only on Zenith Global News.